I wanted to provide just a brief overview of how policy can support circular economy and just go over a little bit about what are some common policies that are used globally related to getting materials back and keeping them in circulation. Then we'll go and do a deeper dive on what extended producer responsibility is and what the implications of implementing it is. What has it been demonstrated to do? And lastly, we'll go over some policy and EPR developments in some select Southeast Asian markets. So let's just start out by talking about why policy is important. The chart on the left is a systems view of what needs to be in place for a sustainable recycling system. And as you can see, supporting policies is part of that system. To really have an effective system, all 6 of those elements need to be in place and doing well to have a robust system. And what policy really can do is provide the legally enforceable standards or requirements for people operating in that system. So it kind of, provides that rule book. It can formalize systems and then align expectations around materials management, and also create disincentives for the material management options you don't want in place. Some policies ensure funding mechanisms that can be used to help develop infrastructure like collection or processing. Things like eco-modulation of packaging fees, for instance, are designed to incentivize the elimination of problematic materials that might make systems more inefficient, and then encourage designs that actually work much better within systems. We have supply side policies that are focused on growing the supply of recovered materials. And then there are demand side policies that really work on creating markets for those recovered materials to ensure that you have a complete system for them. And lastly, one thing that I think is often overlooked is that policy can stimulate, really innovation and economic development. It can create some surety that drives investment because you've lowered risk. So that's an important thing that policy can do. So let's just do a quick review of what are some common policies that are used to support circular economies. Starting on the left around disposal bans. These are quite common in parts of the world, especially the EU. The idea behind them is a disincentive to landfill materials and keep them out of landfills or disposal systems so that they're actually available to recover. Often that's almost a foundational type of policy. Their impact is they can drive participation, not individually, but when they're coupled with other types of policy mechanisms. So recycled content mandates are a demand side policy. The intention of those is to create a known market for recovered materials. So they're very common, and we're seeing a lot of growth in recycled content mandates over the last several years. But one of the important impacts they have is it stabilizes market demand for materials. It creates a known sort of baseline of demand. So it insulates reclaimers from some of the volatility and fluctuation that there is in commodity markets. So those are very beneficial on the demand side. And then we move into the supply side, and that's where we have mechanisms like mandatory recycling, container deposits, or EPR. These are all supply side policies, and they have different sort of levels of impact. Mandatory recycling is something we use in certain US states. They can drive participation and growth in supply. They usually have to be partnered with other types of policies to really be effective. Container deposits, on the other hand, are very focused. They tend to only be on beverage containers. Often there are things that are exempted. But these are some of the highest performing sort of policy solutions we have in terms of growing supply. So you put a deposit on a container that can be redeemed by the consumer when they bring it back. The benefits and impact of this type of policy is it tends to generate high volumes of high quality material. So this is often material that's preferred by reclaimers because it tends to be very clean, very homogeneous. When we moved into EPR systems, again, these are demand side policies. They can be either mandated or they can be voluntary. So I sort of have an example of both. They're most effective when they're mandatory, And it is really intended to help drive funding into the recycling system so that fees are paid on designated packaging, and then those fees in turn are used to help cover the cost of managing those materials and help develop infrastructure. So again, it provides financial support. It adds some coordination and management of the recycling system. So let's transition and just cover some of the highlights of what is extended producer responsibility. It's a policy approach under which producers are given a significant responsibility, either financial and or physical, for the treatment or disposal of post-consumer products. So just that financial and or physical suggests there are a number of different flavors of EPR. Sometimes we see partial financial responsibility or 100% financial responsibility. Sometimes we see EPR systems where both the financial and the physical management of the material is being handled by producers. So there's no one type of EPR. There's sort of a suite of ways it can be implemented. So it's really designed to hold producers, typically for packaging, those are brands and retailers, financially responsible for the end-of-life management of their products or packaging, and to implement standards for management. So in other words, that means what are going to be acceptable management solutions of that designated post-consumer waste. So eco-modulation or eco-modulated fees can serve to incentivize the desired material and formats. Eco-modulation is intended to help drive the types of design for recyclability that you want to see in your particular system. And EPR is really designed to ensure that waste packaging is collected, sorted, and recycled or responsibly disposed. So what it doesn't do is EPR is not designed to grow end markets, for recycled materials. That's really where content type of mandates come to play. EPR is most effective if it's implemented through a formal regulatory scheme that really lays out the plan about who's responsible, what are the targets of recovery, the standards of waste management that the producers must meet. And fees are collected. Those are a critical aspect of it as they support both the management of the system and consumer education. So the producers are typically manufacturers, brand owners. In some cases, it can be distributors, as well as importers of products and packaging. So I do want to say that EPR is not only used for packaging and paper products, but it's also used for a variety of other products. It could be used for electronics, carpeting. We have mattress EPR here in the US. So it's really a policy intended to help define the financial and physical management, but it can apply to any type of or class of product. What we're going to focus on today is really EPR for packaging and paper products. So code for that is EPR for PPP. Is EPR dependent upon the maturity of a market? I think that the answer to that is in the past, yes, but today, no. So we've seen a big global growth in the use of EPR, and we're seeing it in places like Brazil and Chile. And I would say that those are some places where the success is still, a little unclear. It really originated out of Europe. If we break down this sort of concept of EPR, there are three things that usually are common across any type of EPR for packaging and paper products. It needs to be established by legislation that lays out the rules and targets. There's usually one or more producer responsibility organizations. We use PRO for that. And then it's guided by a very detailed program plan. So the roles and responsibilities in EPR, this sort of breaks all of that verbal description down. As you can see, the brands and retailer pay fees into the PRO, and the PRO in turn is then responsible for contracting the services, either to different service providers, or it reimburses local governments for those costs spent on collecting, processing, and transporting recovered materials to market. So this is where that green circle, there's a lot of variety in how systems can be organized. In some cases, the PRO may directly contract with haulers and recyclers, or the local government may want to maintain control. So there's a lot of variety in how that can play out. Then you can see they also work directly with waste management companies, collectors, aggregators, MRF, as well as end markets. They're trying to identify the most efficient way to take collected material and make sure that it actually gets back into products. So this is where we say special assessment for system improvement. This may be looking at the design of packaging, trying to identify if certain things cost more than others to manage, and that in turn informs how they allocate fees. So all of this then is overseen by an external agency, and that's who they would report to in terms of, quantities recovered, volumes recycled, so on and so forth. So there are challenges that are sort of general to implementing any EPR program. Really trying to understand what the appropriate roles are for different levels of government, federal, state, provincial, and local governments. That is sort of step one in terms of these programs, is understanding where is the authority for oversight going to lie? And then what is the proper balance of responsibility, authority, and accountability? So what is the decision-making authority, the balance between the producers and funders versus the pro, so on and so forth. And that's often where we get shared responsibility or 100% responsibility. And then what is the accountability by funding recipients? So those are all things that are sort of negotiated as the program plan is developed. And of course, there's industry engagement as well. So there are some challenges that are specific to Asia. And part of that is the nature of the solid waste and recycling systems. They're complex. There's a lot of stakeholders involved. You have a lot of government agencies, as well as just a lot of stakeholders within the collection system. So the lack of formalized collection infrastructure can be challenging because you need to have oversight. Producers and brands want to know how their fees are being used. And so we're looking for accountability and what are the volumes being collected, so on and so forth. I think another one, and this is actually not specific to Asia, but it is the low level of consumer recycling education and engagement with systems, that consumers really need to have awareness of what they're supposed to recycle and how they're supposed to recycle. And I think that is going to be an area where there needs to be a lot of education and capacity building. And then this is sort of related to the complexity of relationships, but we have a lack of transparency within recovered value chains in Asia often. We have a lot of informal collection. We have a lot of aggregators who may or may not be registered as a formal business. When you have a lot of informal operators, trying to get that level of transparency within your supply chain is very difficult. And we've had very direct feedback from some brands and retail that is one of the real sticking points for them. They need to be able to have that accountability and transparency to understand how fees are going to be used and can they count on the number, the volumes, and what's actually happening to material. A very foundational one is that there's low to no cost for disposal across much of Southeast Asia. So there's very little incentive to move it out of that pathway. And this is where the role of policy might play a role there. But low cost of disposal is a real challenge for EPR systems. There can be a conflict of interest for some stakeholders. There are some cases where you can have people who are both involved in recovery and also involved in policy. Like for haulers who are interested in bringing stuff to a landfill may not be interested in making sure that things are diverted. So that conflict of interest within the supply chain can be a challenge. So just as a focus on Southeast Asia, we're going to be looking at India, Thailand, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Indonesia. And as you can see, the status of EPR across these markets is highly variable. India has had an EPR framework for a while. Vietnam is working on one. Indonesia has a legal framework, but it's really been focused on e-waste and has not established guidelines for packaging yet. And then Thailand has not put forward a legal framework yet. I think that the point I want to make is that there's just a lot of activity. And it's super dynamic. COVID has thrown a lot of hurdles in front of these programs. People are concerned about economic impacts, or people haven't been able to meet. So it's really fluid right now. I think policy can play a really important role for developing an economically sustainable recycling system by addressing specifically funding and creating standards, kind of a clarity on how the system should work. EPR for packaging and paper products, it is really growing. It is demonstrated to be effective, but particularly effective when it's combined with other supportive policies like landfill bans and container deposits. In Asia, it's progressing rapidly, but the development is super dynamic. And we see some framework legislation, we see some consideration of framework legislation. What we don't see yet is really the clarity of the program plans and the implementation structure. COVID has just complicated the whole discussion. Without strong existing regulatory structures in place for recycling or recovery, it's going to require a lot of capacity building as well as plans for monitoring and oversight. And so I think the capacity building needs to happen at all sorts of levels, but that piece around monitoring and oversight will be critical to create confidence and participation in that program. I think that gets to the free rider. By appropriate monitoring and oversight, you will limit the amount of free riders that you have. And then I think this is where I think India did a nice job of specifying what dispositions they didn't want to see. And as we see RDF growing across Southeast Asia, that's something that these schemes are going to have to call out as well.